So before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge that we're gathered today at the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, which is based on the UBC Point Grey campus. At least virtually we are, and some of us are in person, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. You may be joining us from the traditional lands across British Columbia, Canada, and the rest of the world, and we want to make sure to acknowledge the owners and caretakers of those lands as well. The land has been on my mind a lot recently, partly because the current times feel very heavy, and partly also because with spring in the air, there's a deep sense of hope and renewal. And I love being outside in nature, feeling the lands and seeing daffodils and crocuses crop up at different street corners. And lately I've nurtured this connection with our surrounding lands through music, particularly by listening to a music program called Reclaimed, which is the first ever Indigenous music series on CBC Radio and CBC Music, which features incredible music by Indigenous musicians from Canada and the rest of the world. Jarrett Martineau, who is Nihio and Disutlin from Frog Lakes First Nation in Alberta, is the host, creator, and producer of this amazing show. And he's also an award-winning Indigenous media maker, curator, scholar, artist, and storyteller. If you do not know this show yet, I highly encourage you to tune in. So now to the introduction of our speaker today. I'm very excited to be introducing Dr. Liz Selig. I first met Liz actually only about 3 years ago on a small island in Sweden called Vaxholm. And at that time I thought, oh my goodness, how wonderful it would be if I could work more closely with her. And here I am 2 years later, and I'm incredibly honored and privileged to actually be working closely with her. Liz is a deputy director of the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. She received her Bachelor's of Arts from Brown University and her PhD in ecology for the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In her work, Liz focuses on the intersection of environmental and social sustainability in marine ecosystems. And in doing so, she's particularly interested in working on developing the science that informs solutions to our ocean challenges and subsequently translating that science for impact. Liz has more than 10 years of experience working with world-renowned institutions such as Conservation International, where she was the Senior Director of Marine Science, as well as the Smithsonian Institution and the World Resources Institute. Liz is also part of the core team behind the Blue Food Assessment, which is an international assessment looking at the diverse contributions that aquatic foods make to humans and the world. For the last several years, she has also been part of the CBOS Business for Ocean Stewardship, or CBOS for short, which you'll hear more about today, science team. She was a lead author on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short, Global Assessment. And she's also part of the International Science Advisory Council for the Stockholm Resilience Center. And with that introduction, Liz, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Colette. I'm gonna do the screen sharing. 1 second. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for having me here today to talk with you. I only wish very much that it could be in person. And I want to thank Colette for the kind introduction. And I'll just note that she highlighted something about my history, which is that I've moved between academic and NGO positions in my career. And I'd be happy to talk with you about that further in the Q&A. It has definitely shaped my worldview and my research interests, particularly with respect to doing research that has direct linkages to impact on the water. So today I'm just thrilled to be able to present the results of a couple of years of research to develop global risk maps of labor abuse and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And I would just say this work would not have been possible without the dedication and brilliance of the team that's listed here today, which includes the incomparable Colette Wabnitz, who I'm lucky to work with, and I know many of you are as well. As Colette noted, that we actually thought this work would be published by the time this talk came about, but it has not. So I'll just note that I put these little icons on slides that I would prefer that you not tweet about, or either the slide itself or the results that I'm discussing. And I appreciate your understanding in doing that. So I want to just start the talk today by saying that both acknowledging that both the social and environmental sustainability aspects of fisheries have been getting a lot of increased attention, not only in global headlines, but also in policy discussions. And I want to acknowledge that researchers here at UBC have done fundamentally important work on patterns associated not only with labor abuse in fisheries, but also IUU fishing, including all of the various aspects in which it takes an economic and social toll on local and national economies. I deliberately wanted to include some headlines here today to upend a little bit some of the things that we might think we understand about different aspects of social and environmental sustainability, including about where they happen and who is actually perpetrating them. I think there's a lot of assumptions that we've made historically about how much the two issues are tied and who bears responsibility, and of course, what we can do about it. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and just revisit why we actually think we should be talking about the two together. And I think there's two sort of assumptions that underlie this. The first is really about place and the idea that they must be tied because they're happening at the same places. So the exchange of workers and the landing of IUU catches at port, the actual labor abuses and IUU fishing that are happening at sea, and the movement of workers or catches via transshipment at sea. And I'll note that transshipment is this movement of catches or people from one fishing vessel to usually a larger, what's known as a carrier vessel, and I'll be using the term transshipment throughout the talk. There are potential socio-ecological linkages between the two as well. My co-author Jess Sparks, who I know has presented to you here recently, and I think maybe actually presented this feedback loop, but I want to acknowledge it here because I think it's important to think about why we sort of looked at these two together. And you can see that she's identified this loop whereby overfishing and implicitly IUU fishing creates an incentive for labor abuse as a cost-cutting measure, with workers bearing the brunt of those efforts. So I think there are very good reasons to think about the two together, but I'll also just note that there are many reasons, many ways in which they need to be treated differently and separately, particularly with regard to remedy, which I'll talk about later in this talk. So all of the headlines and attention on these issues has meant that corporate and government actors are also beginning to recognize the importance of tackling labor abuse and IUU fishing. Government actors, I would say, have particularly coalesced around SDG 14, Sustainable Development Goal number 14, which is life below water, because it includes an explicit target aimed at IUU fishing. Corporate commitments actually have tied the two more together and as part of a movement towards greater sustainability within their supply chains. Our work was inspired by a desire to provide both government and corporate actors with a greater understanding of where risks of labor abuse and IUU fishing are greatest, so that progress could be made in identifying and prioritizing actions to fulfill the commitments they've made. Over the last several years, we've been in dialogue with many of the companies that are behind this headline that are circled here in red, that are part of the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship, or CBOS, which are 10 of the largest seafood companies in the world. We've been working with them to best understand where they are in terms of the knowledge that they currently have about their supply chains and what kind of information they need to create or to change in their operations and bring them closer to fulfilling their commitments. Although this engagement has been entirely firewalled from our research, the interactions with the companies have been helpful in helping to sort of sharpen our thinking and consider pathways for future action. So I want to talk briefly about the 3 key goals for the work that we've been engaging in. The first was to really try to identify the places that we think are at higher risk for labor abuse and IUU fishing. The CBOS companies were particularly keen for help on this because they wanted to use it to try to understand where some of the greatest risks might be in their supply chains. At the same time, we recognized that just as important would be to try to identify which factors were actually driving risk. And then by understanding where risks are concentrated and some of the mechanisms underlying them, we hoped that our results might be able to inform actions that could be taken with respect to monitoring, control, and surveillance, supply chain transparency, or other evidence-based due diligence measures to mitigate risk. You'll notice that ports are a central focus of this work because they are not only sort of nexus points for vessels coming in to exchange crews and land catches, but they're also where actions can be taken to monitor and enforce laws for both labor abuse and IUU fishing. Very hard to chase after vessels at sea on the open ocean, much easier to do it in port. And also much clearer jurisdiction to act on the findings themselves. Ports also offer a key opportunity for workers to access services and to report on their condition. So this is the broad structure of the talk that I'll be giving today. I'll begin by talking about how we assess risk and why and how we developed the methodological approach that we did. Then I'll walk you through how we mapped risks at port, at sea, and with transshipment, and how we identified or which risk drivers we were able to identify from our modeling framework. Then I'll walk you through how we think different measures at port might offer promise for potentially mitigating risk. And finally, I'll talk about how we've been engaging with some of the sea bus companies in dialogues to understand their risks and what they might be doing to take action on that. So when we started this work, we were excited, like many others, about the capabilities of the Global Fishing Watch data set. But we were also really aware of a few things that are important to consider. One is this really only tells us where the vessels are and some characteristics of those vessels. And that's extremely important. But of course, it doesn't tell us anything about their actual risk of IUU fishing or labor abuse. And second, even though these data sets are constantly improving, they still have major holes where we have little to no AIS data, including areas where we might actually expect a lot of labor abuse or IUU fishing to be happening, or just places that we know are intense fisheries areas. And those include in Southeast Asia and areas off the US and the Caribbean. So to be effectively complementary with the Global Fishing Watch data, we also wanted to try to figure out how we could incorporate some measure of that important risk. And we wanted to focus on risk rather than trying to predict actual occurrences because we felt it was a more actionable framework for actors to work within. So, and we wanted to sort of encourage them to have the kind of information that would allow them to raise the floor, for one way of saying it. So for example, instead of trying to target one vessel that has been engaging in IUU, we wanted to explore how you might want or need to act across a fleet, not only trying to catch today's violator, but also discourage future violations because actions have been taken that have led to expanded monitoring, control, and surveillance. So to do this, we conducted a survey of experts, and it was focused around asking them to assess risks of labor abuse in IUU fishing. One part of the survey, which is generally what I'll be talking about today, focused explicitly on asking them to identify risks at port. And so you see an example of this here. I'll note that the survey protocol was reviewed and approved by Stanford's ethics board. So we sent it out to more than 850 experts and we translated it into 3 languages. So it was presented in English, French, and Spanish. And what the survey did was it allowed us, respondents were able to identify whether or not labor abuse or IUU fishing was happening in particular ports and their degree of certainty about that. And they were also able to say whether or not the port was not associated with labor abuse or IUU fishing. So although the search for ethics reasons, as you might imagine, the survey itself was anonymous, but we did ask one question at the end about what sector the respondents were coming from. And we had a really nice spread of stakeholders who ended up answering the survey. We had around 90 experts that answered at least a few questions within the survey. So now I'll talk a little bit about the model that we developed. And I'll just note that when we talk about assessing risk, we separately assess risk at port, at sea, and with transshipment. For ports, we assessed risk through the expert surveys. That was the primary mode in which we did that. And then for at sea and transshipment, we assessed it together with using both the surveys and the Global Fishing Watch data. And we determined high-risk fishing areas, so the at-sea risk, based on fishing hours of vessels that were going back to risky ports after fishing. So in many cases, fishing vessels, though, they went back to ports where we did not have a port risk score. So to kind of fill in the map, we predicted the port risk of each fishing trip based on the vessel characteristics using a machine learning approach, which is called boosted regression trees. The model was trained using the fishing trips where we knew the vessel characteristics and arrival port risk. And then we used predicted port risk of each of the vessel trips that went to places where we didn't have that data to fill gaps in the map, and then sort of added those risky fishing hours by vessels that were more likely to go back to risky ports after fishing. Through the same modeling framework, we were also then able to tell which vessel characteristics were related to higher port risks. And we used a similar approach for transshipment by determining high-risk transshipment areas where many transshipments occurred and where carrier vessels returned to risky ports after meeting fishing vessels. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the results where we mapped these risks at port, at sea, and with transshipment. And just a quick reminder, because I know I went through a lot of methods very quickly in the last thing of what you'll be seeing in the maps to come. So for ports, it's really a measure of the degree of certainty of whether a port was used for either moving IUU catches, landing IUU catches, or moving people into or out of labor abuse. For the at-sea maps, those are risky places at sea based on the landing port, the flag and the gear type, and a few other characteristics. And it's really where we have the highest fishing hours of risky vessels. And then for transshipments, it's the concentration of risky transshipments based on carrier and fishing vessel flags, time at sea, gear type of the fishing vessel involved in the transshipment, and a behavior known as loitering. So I'll begin here by talking about the patterns that we see with ports and labor abuse. I'll note that to develop the risk scores for ports, we took into account both the level of the certainty of the respondent and the number of respondents that scored that port. So we presented all of our respondents with a list in the end of around 2,600 ports were available for assessment within the survey. They weren't presented with all 2,600. They could, at the beginning of the survey, identify which regions and countries they were expert in, and then they were presented with a list of ports for those country or countries. And in the end, they assessed around 790 ports across almost 90 countries for their associations with labor abuse and IUU fishing. And what we found was more than 56% of ports were associated with either labor abuse or IUU fishing, and about 32% with both. And here you can see places in deep red are those where experts had the highest certainty that a port was associated with labor abuse. And those that are sort of in blue are those that were identified as being not associated with labor abuse. And darker blue are where multiple experts were able to say that they did not think the port was associated with labor abuse. Sorry, I clicked too quickly. So you can see here that there are major areas in sort of concentrations of higher risk on ports along the West African coast, as well as ports in Southeast Asia and South America. And I'll also just note that, that there are clearly also ports that are risky in places that perhaps we talk about less related to labor abuse in Northern Europe and other places. And for illegal fishing, you can see, and I'll just take a moment to toggle back and forth between the two so you can let your eyes make some of the connections between the two. But there was, as you can see, a sort of a generally strong relationship between risks associated with labor abuse and IUU fishing at port. You can see, though, for illegal fishing that there's a higher risk for ports in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, specifically associated with Peru and Ecuador, and that there's a higher degree of sort of certainty of illegal fishing associated with ports off the West African coast. First, let me orient you a little bit to this next set of maps, which are going to talk about the risks associated with labor abuse and IUU fishing at sea and with transshipment. So you can see here that the higher risk areas are in the sort of reddish color, medium risk are in yellow color, and low risk are in blue color. And places where they overlap have the hash of the whatever combination of risk levels are intersecting in that place. You'll also note that in there's these areas that are in light gray, and those are where Global Fishing Watch does not have data. And so just wanted to be transparent about where those places are. So in looking for patterns for risks at sea for labor abuse, you can see that there's distinct high risk areas in the Eastern Tropical Pacific off the coast of Peru and off of Argentina, and particularly off of West Africa along the western coast of Africa, as well as around the Azores and the Maldives and a bit around Chagos. For IUU fishing, there's some similar areas. And again, I'll just toggle back and forth a little bit between the two so that you can see some of the similarities and some of the differences. There's a lot of similarities in sort of some of the regions where it's happening, but you can see that the size or the magnitude of those areas is different. So for IUU fishing, it's much more extensive in the Western Indian Ocean. And that may be because some of the ports where those areas were being landed for IUU fishing, there was a greater degree of knowledge or certainty associated with IUU fishing as opposed to labor abuse. For transshipment, you'll notice that these maps become even more colorful, basically that you see a lot of hashing, which I think is a really interesting pattern, and it suggests that there's a lot of travel movement. So within these areas where transshipment is occurring, the vessels are returning to a variety of low, medium, and high risk ports, which suggests that, that there's probably a fair bit of due diligence that may be done particularly around the ports that are higher risk, so that the vessels that are returning to those after transshipping are subject to greater scrutiny. But you can see higher risk areas for labor abuse, again, sort of concentrated mostly around the western coast of Africa and around both sides of the southern tip of South America. For IUU fishing, we see somewhat of distinct patterns here, both in the Indian Ocean, particularly in this sort of band area off of the coast of South Africa and extending across the Indian Ocean. And I think, again, it's really important, I think, both from supply chain and government perspectives to understand sort of the landing port of these, to sort of understand the likelihood of risk and design of stewardship opportunities to potentially mitigate those, risks. So now I'll move on to talking about risk drivers and what the model was able to tell us about what might be driving some of the risks we observed. So just to remind you of what the risk drivers were, and first I want to acknowledge that these are clearly not the only factors that are driving risk for labor abuse and IUU fishing, but they are the ones that we had consistently within the data set to explore. So for example, for labor abuse, I think there's a number of both push and pull factors that affect risk, as well as enabling conditions that relate to legal and policy frameworks and power imbalances, all of which are likely to shape risk. But as I said, these are the ones that we could explore. So these are not the only ones. Most of these I think are pretty self-explanatory. I'll just mention that loitering behavior is something that you can pick up in the Global Fishing Watch data set. This is where you have a single vessel that sort of basically looks like it should be transshipping because it's moving quite slowly, but there's no other vessel that's observed nearby in the AIS data. And so it's potentially indicative of a number of things, including a transshipment that's occurring with one of the AIS responders turned off. So I'll start by talking about risk drivers for at-sea fishing. And you'll note that flag appears to be very important for both labor abuse and IUU fishing. And what you see here is the predictor importance, or essentially how much of each of the listed variables explained the port risk scores. I'll also just note that something that was interesting that emerged from us here is that time at sea was not a very strong predictor here, which I think is actually indicative of labor abuse occurring both on short haul and longer duration fishing vessel trips, something which is supported within the literature as well. For transshipment, we see different risk factors at play. You can see here that also there isn't like a clear overall winner like flag for fishing, that it's a more nuanced picture, but that clearly gear and the flag of the carrier vessel are important here. And you can see that loitering emerges for IUU fishing as a potential risk driver, and that time at sea shows up more prominently for transshipment than it did for fishing. So because flag was so important in the model, we wanted to really kind of dig in and look at particular flag patterns. And initially when we did this, we tried looking at traditional flags of convenience, but there were clearly patterns going on that we weren't being able to pick up by looking at flags of convenience as one group. So we were really fortunate. Jessica Ford and Chris Wilcox recently published a paper where they grouped vessels according to, or vessel flags according to 3 primary factors. The first was the degree of ownership by countries other than the flag state, the fidelity of the vessel to the EEZ of the flag state, and the degree of control, control of corruption of the flag state. They had 3 flag groups that emerged by looking at the properties of the flags across those 3 factors. We chose to add an additional category here, which is China, and that's because of its dominance in the data set, that it was more than 60% of fishing vessels. And so in order to really be able to separate out effects, we chose to have it as its own separate category. And then flags that were not categorized by Ford and Wilcox constitute the other flag category. So when we looked at this and we looked at vessel flag risks according to group, more interesting patterns began to emerge. And let me just orient you to these. So the effect of the flag group on the port risk score, if it's positive, it's riskier. So that means it's contributing to greater risk. If it's basically at 0 or negative, it means that it's less risky. So you can see for at-sea fishing, for labor abuse, flag group 2 and China emerge as the riskier flag groups. And for IUU fishing in particular, it's a combination of flag group 2, China, and flag group 1. And just so that I know that you haven't memorized the flag groups yet, I'll just toggle back to this page so that you can see who that is. And flag group 2 is sort of dispersed and it's in yellow. And then you see China here in purple. And for flag group 1, these are 6 flags that are often associated with relatively hard to see countries on a map. And they're pointed out either by red or with the pointers themselves. So I'll note then for transshipment, we see the following patterns. And one difference here is that the scale is different. So transshipment vessels sort of across the board tended to use riskier ports to land at. But important ones here, you can see flag group 1. So it's a different set of flags than what we saw for at-sea fishing. And flag group 1, again, are those 6 flags that are associated with high ownership by countries other than the flag state and low EEZ fidelity. You'll also note that the other group was important here. That's actually a relatively small number of trips. So would focus more on the patterns associated with flag group 1 in this case for transshipment. Oops. So next I'll talk a little bit about some of the analyses that we did to best understand how patterns at port related to labor abuse and IUU fishing might suggest some actions that could be taken to mitigate risks. And just again, we really focused on these things at port because we felt that it's logistically easier to and with better leverage for making a difference towards mitigating risk. So for labor abuse, we focused on understanding patterns related to how long vessels stopped in port. And this is because ports are one of the few places to be able to identify and respond to labor abuse. But that actually really depends a lot on how long the vessel stays in port, because time in port affects the ability of fishers to get off the vessels to disembark, and it also affects their ability to have time to access port services where they could potentially report on labor conditions on their vessels or to seek remedy. Short port durations really make all of this a lot harder, and they also decrease the opportunity for labor inspections and actually being able to call for some of the assistance that is sometimes needed to help workers that have been abused. So here we looked in a linear mixed effects model, looking at the log of the port stop duration in hours as a response variable and the flag group as an explanatory variable. And I'll just note that this is entirely separate from the risk mapping that you've seen thus far. So it's an entirely separate analysis. And what you can see here is that vessels in flag group 2 have the shortest port durations and sort of markedly shorter port durations. And these are the vessels that we found to be riskier related to at sea in the risk mapping analysis. And they're the ones that are linked to poor control of corruption and low EEZ fidelity. So I think this is sort of instructive of the potential for mitigating labor abuse by ensuring that there's sufficient time in port to identify and respond to labor abuse, and kind of digging in deeper into some of the dynamics that happen and the ability of fishers to disembark with the laws and policies in place in some of the places that are potentially riskiest. For IUU fishing, we looked at a different aspect, focusing on the possibility of port state measures, and particularly the port state measures agreement to reduce IUU fishing risks. So the port state measures agreement, for those that aren't familiar with it, it was ratified and entered into force in 2016, and it's designed to reduce IUU fishing by making it difficult for foreign flagged fishing and support vessels, including the carrier vessels that I've talked about associated with transshipment, and for bunker vessels, which you can see here in the upper right, that provide fuel and other supplies to sort of enable fishing vessels to stay at sea longer. And what the Port State Measures Agreement stipulates is more rigorous procedures at port, including pre-notification, standards around inspection, data exchange so that authorities are aware of whether a vessel has violated regulations in other jurisdictions, and then to deny those vessels access to port if necessary. So what we, knowing the importance of port state measures and sort of potentially preventing or mitigating IUU risks, we wanted to see how vessel behavior changed after the PSMA entered into force. So we did sort of a very broad analysis. This is kind of an initial look at this, comparing where vessels went in 2015 with where they went in 2017. And we analyzed fishing vessels, carrier vessels, and bunker vessels as part of this. But I'm going to focus just on the patterns related to the fishing vessels here. And so you can see here that certain fishing vessel flags, including China, and again, this sort of flag group 2, those that have poor control of corruption, were less likely to visit countries that had ratified PSMA 1 year after it entered into force compared to the year before PSMA ratification. You'll note that the uncertainty estimates are sort of quite large, but I think it's paints an interesting picture looking across the 3 separate analysis for the risk mapping, the labor abuse work, and then the IUU fishing work, and kind of coming to understand that some of these fishing vessel flags seem to have characteristics on their behavior that suggest that they are risky across different dimensions. I'll also note, of course, that when we looked at this, we weren't looking at all at implementation of PSMA. And so I think what we're kind of able to look at here is the perception that there's an increased likelihood in the detection of IUU catches. But I think it shows it illustrates promise of port state measures as a potential way to mitigate these risks. But definitely further analyses will be needed to think about how these patterns persist over time. And of course, to avoid vessels going to neighboring countries where they start to figure out that the port state measures aren't implemented as effectively as they are in another place. So I think really important to sort of understand that clearly there's a perception at least and an ability to move and to be responsive and adaptive to those dynamics as we think about ways to mitigate IUU fishing over time. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the dialogues that we've had with some of the CBOS companies around the analyses that we've done and to try to better understand how you might work with stakeholders who are actually trying to actively engage with these types of results and implement actions that might reduce their risks. So as we began these conversations with different companies, I think immediately apparent to us was that there's a wide range in the type of data that the companies currently collect. And we've tried to have the key message and also tried to design the risk mapping results and analysis around the idea that there's always a meaningful place to start, even if you're in this low data category. And I think there's still important things that companies can learn about their risks that inform different actions that they might be able to take. So I'm just going to briefly walk through what that sort of looks like for the low and high data scenarios. So here in blue, you just see an FAO fishing area, and in orange, or sort of a stylized version of one of our risk areas. And I think important to understand that for some companies, what they might have at hand is essentially which FAO fishing area they've sourced from and the species that they've fished. So in this scenario, a company would basically be able to understand roughly an estimated percentage of their catch from a high risk area. But they won't know that exactly because they don't know where in Area 41 in this case they've actually sourced from, and they don't know whether they're landing at high risk ports or whether they're using high risk vessels. But they can start to get a sense of where they might want to dig deeper and learn more. And then they can also move on to try to begin to collect data that will better inform them, including which vessels they source from, which ports they use, and that will help to give them a sense of a greater idea of what their risks are. In a high data scenario where they actually know the specific vessels that they're sourcing from, and they know where their catches are being landed, and they may even know specific risks associated with transshipment. And in this case, they can get a much greater sense of their risk level and where it might make sense to focus due diligence efforts. So for example, in this case, you may be more worried about a high risk vessel like the one on the bottom that's essentially fishing in a high risk area and going to landing at a high risk port than you would be about the higher risk vessel that's in red, where that's fishing in a lower risk area and returning to a lower risk port that has high risk vessel characteristics. So essentially you can sort of build on the knowledge that you have to get a better sense of where you want to look deeper, and then with that knowledge, hopefully design some actions that can mitigate those risks. This has been our general process for working with the company. So understanding what their current knowledge level is, working with them to assess risks, being iterative and adaptive. So in many cases, the companies that we've worked with have said, oh, okay. And then they've gone out and asked their suppliers questions about which ports they're landing in and more detailed information about where they're actually fishing. And then we can look at the risk mapping data and sort of reassess their particular risk profile. But I think it's been really helpful for us to kind of do this iterative process with them, and it's helping also for us to understand what we might need to do in the future to sort of better inform more finer scale understanding of risk for them. So I just want to end by saying I think higher risk areas for labor abuse and IUU fishing, they're clearly major challenges for governments, companies, and other key actors to manage. And ideally, they manage that risk collaboratively by focusing on the different dimensions and elements of risk that are within their control, rather than just sort of throwing their hands up and taking their business elsewhere, but really actively engaging with and trying to reduce risks in the places that they can. And our perspective with this work really has always been that these high risk areas offer opportunities for stewardship by actors in those places, and that actions by those actors will help to move the sector towards greater social and environmental sustainability in fisheries to come. Thanks so much, and very happy to have been here with you today, and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Liz, for this great presentation. I think we can start the Q&A with a question from William.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Liz, and welcome to our seminar. It's really great talk, very interesting and important topic. So I have a quick observations and then a question. In the risk map, it's really worrying to see that lots of the high risk area that you identified also match up with, as you know, our projections of where the fish stocks are going to decline. So I think it really further highlight that in the future, those areas may even be, the risk may even be exacerbated with a decrease in resources. Maybe something that would be useful to follow up on looking at the future risk as well. My question is that I think the results will be really useful to inform the mitigations and solutions that you mentioned. Some of those, a lot of those mitigation measures require international collaborations. I think in terms of where the fleets go and checking them, and then in the port, kind of take actions on that. And given the current situations of how international geopolitics are playing out, are you optimistic that these or do you foresee what kind of challenges that will be in implementing some of those mitigations options that you are thinking about or proposing based on your work? Thank you very much.
Thanks, William. It's a great question. And just speaking briefly to your first comment, I think we recognize that risks may change. And while we probably can't recalculate port risks, and they probably don't change very quickly over time, although maybe with big intervention they can, we can certainly look at pattern, like how the actual use patterns and where the vessels go change over time, and look at some of changing risk potentially associated with climate change as it may happen with vessel patterns shifting. To your second point, I think, I always like to think I'm an optimist and a realist. I think, in some cases, there's such a strong motivation for economic reasons to continue to be able to find ways for to work together, particularly for fishing nations for which fisheries are a major part of their economic revenues. Even with the geopolitical situation happening in the world, I was struck that Norway and Russia have continued to operate under the fisheries agreement in the Arctic that they've hammered out, and so I think to some degree, at least for a little while, there'll be some inertia around some of the agreements that are in place. I think what's probably both a bigger challenge and opportunity is for companies and governments to figure out how to work together in the places where companies are operating and that are really important for their business, that they work productively with the governments, and particularly around exchange of information, which I think sounds straightforward, but it is decidedly not. And I think a lot could be done with both of them making commitments towards greater transparency and also calling for action, but on both sides. So greater supply chain transparency, perhaps on the company side, and greater efforts at monitoring, control, and surveillance in port on the government side.
Thank you. The next question is from Roshni.
Hi, thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. I guess the first thing is a comment. I guess I wasn't aware about like the labor abuse in the Chagos area and the Western Indian Ocean from Mauritius. And so that was really interesting to see. I might be stuck.
You're frozen, but I still hear you. Except now I don't.
It's fine. She's going to rejoin after. Josh, meanwhile, okay. Can you ask your question?
Yeah, great presentation. Thanks for sharing your amazing study. My question is with abuse of labor abuse, is there any sort of issue regarding if there's people reporting this, especially in countries where there might not be policing or as much enforcement, that there might be repercussions towards people that try to report? And you hear some of these stories, especially with fisheries observers in certain parts of the world that are afraid to comment about certain fishing practices that happen. Is there anything like that that you've been able to correct for in any of your data, or any issues you've come across?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Josh. And I'll just acknowledge that Jess Sparks is definitely the labor expert on our team and works with this more closely than I do. But for sure, and I think one of the things that's really important in some of the ongoing work that we're doing together is that is sort of, when I say access to port services, it's essentially places where workers can go within ports that allow them to anonymously report on abuse or to get help, often from religious organizations that operate missions within the ports, or other civil society organizations that are targeted towards protection of workers. Without that, I think it's very challenging, as you might imagine, both from a language standpoint, even from being able to call the embassy of your home country in a place where you don't necessarily have a SIM card that works, where you may not be able to leave the port area. So we're very mindful of that and sensitive to it. I think if Jess were here, she would probably also flag, that for sure these concerns extend to observers as well, and which is why asking them to try to also report on labor conditions can be really problematic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rashni is joining again. Colette, meanwhile, you have a question?
I was just, I was waiting for Rashni, but I was just going to say, knowing that Liz has an associated project on labor abuse, and given that question, maybe to highlight some of the different elements that are relevant to some of the work to address some of these issues. But Rashni, go ahead.
Sorry. Anyway, I was just saying that it was really interesting to see that about the labor abuse in the Western Indian Ocean and also in the Chagos area, because I'm from Mauritius, and that was really eye-opening, and I didn't know it happened so much in that part of the world. But my question is more related to when you're talking about the different risk drivers, and you mentioned that flag was the main one. I was wondering if you could expand on the gear part of it.
Yeah, so I mean, so flag was the predominant one for at-sea fishing. And for gear, it's associated with particular risks that we see on particular gear types, and so for that's, it's a little bit different for transshipment versus at sea. So, but largely that falls to squid jiggers, trawlers, and set and drifting long lines, and is more important for transshipment versus at sea fishing.
Okay. Did you see, like, just to piggyback on that, did you see like certain areas where like trawling was more dominant in relation to labor abuse?
Yeah, so I would say, we were looking generally more at overall patterns, and something that we've thought about doing is looking at sort of what do risk maps look like for particular gear types. It's not something we've delved into yet, but have thought about doing it, for say tuna purse seiners or longliners, and for other gear types. So you're thinking in the right direction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colette.
Yeah, and if I may, Liz, I hope that's okay to just say, Rashni, also one of the things with the gears and the data set that we used to remember is that it's based on GFW data. And so that data is very heavy on the high seas and not very good in the EEZs. And so I think that some of the patterns that you might be interested in would particularly be prevalent within EEZs. And that's a whole different ballgame. So that's definitely something that we're also interested in, and where VMS data can become more interesting, and we're working in that direction. But yeah, just to remember that the GFW AIS data set is really helpful and informative for the high seas. And I hope you're still there, because I think you're frozen.
That's a great point. Thank you.
I had a small question. How did you compute and rank the score? What was your methodology? What was the stats behind it? Because you're using a multivariate analysis with, I'm pretty sure, some massive correlation between the variables. So just to have an idea.
So I didn't, we used a bunch of different types of analysis in the ones that I showed. So for the risk mapping work, that was mainly these boosted regression trees. And then for looking at some of the patterns associated with different things, it was linear mixed effect models and other things. So you probably have to narrow down which one you're curious about, and I'm happy to say more about
the risk assessment and how you created the rank between your variables.
Yeah, so with the boosted regression trees that we used, you can calculate something called SHAP values, which parses out the predictor importance. And that was the primary way that we sort of assessed the risk drivers for at-sea fishing and associated with transshipment.
And did you include some dummy variable to see the robustness of the variable that you have been using? So
we didn't do that, but we did drop. So we did robustness analysis by dropping 10 or 20% of the data to see if the patterns changed, and and those results were robust to what we found. And happy to, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Liz, for this really wonderful presentation. And so I wanted to thank you on behalf of all of us at the IOF.